I hope the day has been great so far and that you enjoyed the previous sessions that's been going through today. It's been really fun to listen to Mirko and Jürgen and Stefan and everyone who's been talking. So let's get into my topic of the day. But before we do that, let me just introduce myself. My name is Timmy Andersson. I'm 33 years old or young, depending on how you see it. I'm a senior consultant working with, working for CT Global Services. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP within enterprise mobility. And I have a background in client management. So I've started out with Configuration Manager a long time ago and been working for that, with that for a long, long time. And for about 2 or 3 years ago, I started getting into Intune more and more. So a lot of my focus today will be Intune. But as we see with the Endpoint Manager now that Microsoft is pushing hard, is that Configuration Manager and Intune is just getting more and more intertwined with each other. And as also Jürgen mentioned before, is that we're getting more tools in our toolbox. And it's not about choosing one over the other or saying that config manager is dead or whatever it is, because that's not true. It's just be able to have more choices. With that said, we're going to talk a little about managing Intune with PowerShell. But before we get into the PowerShell part, we need to also talk about Graph API. And the reason for that is that Graph API is actually the thing that we interact with all the time, even though we don't know it. And we need to talk about that before we get into the PowerShell stuff, because that's gonna make a little bit more sense in the end. So, but this session here will cover an intro to Graph API. We'll also have a basic understanding on how Intune communicates with Graph. We will learn how to get started with using the Intune PowerShell SDK. In my opinion, that's the lowest barrier of entry to start with PowerShell and automating stuff within Intune. And also, I'm going to show a few demos here, which hopefully will be inspirational for you. I'm not saying that this is the way you should do it. I'm just saying this is a way you could do it. Pretty much. So let's start with this overview here. So hopefully everyone is familiar with the Intune portal, or at least the device management portal, or even the Azure Active Directory portal. So for a long time, we were used to go to portal.azure.com. And from portal.azure.com, we can then reach Intune or Azure Active Directory, whatever it is. And when we use the portal, we actually communicate with Graph API all the time. So anything we do from the portal gets pushed down to Graph API. And the Graph then later on redirects all the traffic to the service endpoints, which is the backend of Microsoft. So we always need to go through the Microsoft API SDK layer of things. And as long as we can communicate with that, we can do pretty much all the stuff we can do from the Intune portal or let's take the Intune portal, for example. We can also do not using a web browser if we want to, as long as we can do web requests. But we're going to talk about that more in depth a little bit later. But this is just an illustration how the communication works, that anything you do in the portal gets pushed to the Graph API SDK, and which in turn relays it back to the backend to Microsoft, and stuff happens. And the Graph API is a REST API, and Microsoft actually has a really good blog post that Brad Anderson wrote. I can't remember when that was, if that was 2 years ago now. Time flies really fast, but there was a post from Microsoft at least where they explained why they choose Graph or a REST API is the correct term. Why they choose a REST API before something else? Because they were actually looking at other things as well on how they can make their cloud or online stuff work in a really good way. But anyhow, they ended for a REST API, so that's what we have today. And within Microsoft Graph, we have a query format. And this contains, so let's start on the left side of this slide, where we have get. And a get is just a way of retrieving data, pretty much. So if we want to look at data or get any data that's within Graph, we will do a get command. We'll then have a post command, and the post command is used when you want to add data to Graph and just post it. So let's say, for an example, if you're creating a compliance policy within Intune, what you're actually doing there is you're sending a post request to create new data within Intune. So that is post. I'm just drinking some coffee here too. And then we have the put command. So the put will be used when you assign data within Microsoft Graph. So maybe you're linking two resources together, then you're usually using put as the command. Then we have patch, and patch essentially updates existing data. So if there is some object that has data that equals 1 and you update it and then it's now equal 2, you do a patch. So you already have an object within Graph and then you update it, then you use a patch. Because we don't have to create a new object, we just need to update an existing one. And of course, we also have delete. So anytime we want to delete something, remove data, we use a delete command. So this is the things that we need to work with pretty much. So we have get, we have post, put, patch, and delete. That's pretty simple. And from there, we have what we would call an URL request. So all the requests we are doing to the Graph API is through an URL. So I won't go through this in full detail, but there is actually some logic to how the URL is built up. And once you have played around with it a little bit and actually looked at it, it makes sense after a while. But it can take a while. It took a while for me, at least, to understand exactly how everything works. But what we do is we have a URL request, and within that request, we then put a method to it. That is the methods that we looked at, which is put, get, delete, whatever it is. And to be a little bit more specific, what I would like to show you guys today is the developer mode within a web browser. So in pretty much any web browser you have, if you press F12, you will get into something that's called a developer mode. So within the web browser, if we look at the developer mode, we will be able to follow along with all the requests that's being sent from the web browser to whatever service we are communicating with. And this is really great, especially when we are talking about Intune or Graph in general, because now we can start figuring out what is actually happening here. And if we want to replicate that, what kind of commands are our web browser sending back to Graph? So let's have a look at that. So I'm just currently in my test environment here. I'm in the device management portal. And if I do F12 from here, I would need to go into, let's see if I can use Zoom it here, network. And from here, anything I do in my web browser now, if I need to navigate, it will show up here with all the kinds of different requests that's being made. And it's going to be a lot of requests, but I'm going to show you which one that we are looking for. So if I go into devices, and let's continue on into Windows and Windows devices. And let's just take my first device here. So all the information that gets returned to my web browser that we see here, the device name, the primary user, the serial number, all of that is data that is stored and gathered, well, that we get back from Graph API. And so what the web browser does is just it sends the request to Graph, and then the portal itself just displays the information. So if I look in here, let's see if this is the correct one. Not sure, but we can figure it out. We can see here that we have a request URL. So right now I'm requesting, it says this is beta, so this, yeah, beta is right, user is okay, and we have a get method, meaning that we are retrieving data. We also have a status code 200 OK. This is green is always good. And this is just part of the request that's being made. So if I do anything in here on my device, let's say I want to click sync. When I click sync here now and do yes, I will send a URL request back to Graph, and that will perform the action I actually wanted it to do. So if we go down here, I don't know, let me know if I need to zoom. Let's do this. We can see here that we have something that says sync device. So this is when I press sync device, the URL, well, the request was sent. And what I end up with here is a request URL, which points to device management, manage device. Then we have a GUID, which is the identifier for the device I'm actually looking at. And then it's sending a sync device. And it's doing a post method. So what I then can do is, if I have this request URL and the method, I can just take that and I can invoke that however I want. We can do that with PowerShell or other things. As long as you can do a web request, you can do the same stuff outside of browser, pretty much. So this is, I use this F12 method when I need to figure out a way to do something in an automated fashion. So I'm going to show you later on a simple script on how to sync devices. But if it's not covered within the PowerShell SDK that we also will take a look at, what I do, I go in here, I figure out the request URL, and then the method. As long as I have that, I can replicate this and work with that. So that's really neat, especially when there are new features and you're not sure how stuff works. It's really nice to go in here and look. That's at least what I do. I find that very interesting. So once we now know that everything we do from the portal is always sending a request URL, either to change data, get data, or execute on data, pretty much. The next thing we should have a look at is the Graph Explorer. Because I think that was my next slide, demo Graph Explorer. Yes, correct. So I don't know how many of you have used this before, but Graph Explorer is an explorer that Microsoft provides. You can use this with fake data that Microsoft provides as well, or you can log on to your own tenant and play around with live data if you would like to do that. And so what you need to do is you need to go to developer.microsoft.com, and from there you can just navigate into the Graph Explorer, or you can just go into Google or whatever search engine you're using and just Google Graph Explorer Microsoft, and it will get you to this page here. And as you can see, I'm currently logged in with my account in my test environment. I can sign out from here if I want to, and then I can play around with data from Microsoft. But I want to play with live data that's in my demo tenant. So that's why I'm signed in. So if I want to do the same thing that I did here with the sync device from the Graph Explorer, what I can do is I can just copy the URL request. I can go into Graph Explorer. I need to change. Oh, this is bugged now. I need to refresh, I think. Nope. I don't know what happened here, but I saw this the other day. It started. I can not allow to change the method up here. So let me just sign out and in again. So now I'm signed out. I need to sign in again. And I'm still not allowed to change. So annoying. Let's test the preview if that works better. Okay, the preview works better. There is a switch here where you could toggle between the preview and the old version. I'm just lazy, so I don't necessarily use the preview that often, but it works just as fine. And from here, then I need to do a post, because we saw that in our web request. Request method was a post. Then I copy the URL. I need to change this to beta. It will automatically change as well if I copy in the URL. So now I just copy the URL. I'm going to do run query. And it's just running. But what's going to happen here is will give us, again, a status code 204, no content, and that's fine. And what's happening is we are running the device sync that we did from the UI in here, but we are running it through the Graph Explorer instead. So that's really neat, a neat way to play around with the URL requests to see what works and what doesn't work. And this also works if, let's see if we go back to get. The Graph Explorer is a way to, again, play around with data that's within Graph. So if I just run this default query here that says me, I will then get information about my user account. So I'm currently logged on with Timmy. So if I run this URL request here, I get information about my user. So here's a phone number, here is my name, my job title, my email address, and whatever it is. So this is information that's stored on pretty much my AD account. So this is a great way to just get started playing around with the web requests and everything that's related to that. So anything you can do from the console in here, as long as you have the request URL and the request method, you can do that from the Graph Explorer. And we can actually try something else here just to show you that it works. If we do compliance policy. So right now, we only have 2 compliance policies within this tenant here, but we can create a new one actually. So let's see if we can do this. So let's create a new policy, Windows 10 policy. Let's give it a good name. And just add some configuration. That's fine. So as soon as I click create here, we will get a new request. And let's see if we can find a request that was created. Device compliance policy. So here. So once we created our compliance policy, we have our request URL. So let's copy that. See if we can change. Oh, now we can change it. And it's a post. That's good. But now to the interesting part. Since we are creating an object within Graph, what's being sent back is called a JSON object. So the JSON object contains all the information that we have configured. So if we take a look here, we can see, oh, the display name I choose was SCUGSE. And I've added some password requirements, and all the information about the policy I configured is in this payload here. So what I need to do is I can do view source, and I can just copy everything in here and paste it here. I can go back into Intune, and we can delete the actual policy. So right now, we only have 2 policies again. And in theory, if the demo gods is with us today, if I do run query here, we will create the same compliance policy that we created from the UI before. So again, here we see all the data that gets pushed through. We go back into our console, we refresh, and we have SCUGSE, a new compliance policy. And what I've been seeing, there is, I can't remember who it was, or it could be multiple people, but someone has started creating a backup, a PowerShell backup job that actually takes backup of your configuration within Intune. So what happens with that job is it just takes all the JSON objects for all your policies and device configurations and stuff like that, and it saves the JSON object, because as soon as you have the JSON object that contains all the information about your setting, you can just create your settings again if you want to. So you can back up all your settings and you can import them in again. So that's a really neat way. And that's usually done with PowerShell because it's just easier with PowerShell. So that was just a short walkthrough through the Graph Explorer and how you can get started working with the data from Graph. And let's continue. So my next slide would be, let's take it up here. Oh. Let's do this. So let's talk about the Intune PowerShell samples. So there are some confusions out there that I see a lot in different threads online on Reddit and Facebook and stuff, because Microsoft actually have what they call the PowerShell Intune samples. And these samples is great. You can use them, but it should not be conflicted with the Intune PowerShell SDK. Because the Intune PowerShell SDK is it's a module pretty much that contains commandlets, so you can execute different types of commandlets to Intune. The PowerShell Intune samples is the same thing, but it's just a little more in a rough format. So if you go to this GitHub page here, you can find a lot of PowerShell scripts on a lot of different things. but it's not necessarily very user-friendly if you're new to PowerShell, or maybe if you're new to Graph API in general. Because if you go into and look at the scripts here, they are usually pretty long. There are several hundred lines. So let's go there. Yeah, so we have 500, almost 600 lines in this script here. And what the Intune SDK does is just simplifies everything. So I just wanted to mention that the PowerShell Intune samples are here, and they are great if you know what you're doing. But if you're new and just wanted to start out managing Intune with PowerShell, I wouldn't recommend you using these samples here. So just mentioning that. And then we have the Intune PowerShell module. And the Intune PowerShell module is on a different GitHub page. And as I mentioned before, the SDK just contains, well, it's a PowerShell module aimed to make it easier for administrators to administrate Intune with PowerShell. So you can go to this GitHub page here, and you can download it from here if you want. But the simplest way is to use the install module. And we're going to look at that now and see how we can get started with the SDK. But just be aware that there is a GitHub page for SDK. And if you have any feedback, Microsoft is always looking at the feedback that's get committed here to GitHub. So if you find a bug or anything, just post it here on GitHub, and Microsoft will take a look at it and try to help you find a solution for it. So let's turn to PowerShell. So I know that the demo gods is not entirely on my side today. I didn't do enough sacrifices, it seems like. So I'm going to be a little bit careful on what I do here. But essentially, if you just want to get started with the Intune SDK, this is the line you need to run. You need to do install-module and then -name microsoft.graph.intune. You don't have to do the force. The force is only if you have already been installed and you want to make sure that you have the latest version. But if you run this command here, you will start downloading the PowerShell module from PowerShell Gallery. You will get prompted with 3 prompts saying that you need some other stuff as well, but you just need to accept that, and it will download in and install the module. Once you have the module, once you run the install module, you need to import the module. And you can also check if you have the module available when running get module. And you can see that you have the module installed. You can see the version that you have installed. And the latest version is actually 1907. So it's almost a year old, but that is the latest version that Microsoft has released so far. So that's what we have to work with. And let's take a look what we have inside the module. So this is the fun stuff. So within the module, we have a bunch of commandlets. And this again is to do stuff within Intune, but through PowerShell instead. So if I want, let's just search for compliance policy. So as you can see here, hopefully, we have a command that's called get Intune device compliance policy. So if I run this commandlet here, I will get a list of all my compliance policy within Intune. And I can see my device compliance policy assignment. And it's built up in a way that you have get. So again, we are retrieving data. We have the invoke. That's usually when there is an action we want to trigger. There is an invoke commandlet for it. If we want to create a new Intune device compliance policy, we do it with new dash Intune device compliance policy. And we have remove. This is just the delete function So if you want to delete something. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So we have get, new, invoke, and remove for the different types of commandlets, depending on what we want to do. And there is a bunch of commandlets in here. I can't remember the total amount, but this, okay, 1,569 different commandlets within the PowerShell Intune SDK. So definitely install it, have a look at it, and start using it. And once you have installed it, the first thing you need to do is run the command that's called connect-msgraph. So this is to connect yourself to the tenant you want to manage. So I've just put force interactive here because once you run this, if I run connect-msgraph, you will retrieve a auth token, and this token is auto-renewed with the SDK, so that's really nice. So if I've already logged in once with the SDK here, it will auto-renew the token. So just to show you that if I do force interactive, I will get the logon page here. So again, I need to identify myself and I need to connect to the tenant I want to connect to. And once I've got my token, I can see my username here, I can see my tenant ID here. Again, this now also RBAC comes in play. As Mirko was talking about earlier today is the RBAC. So we have RBAC in Intune and we also have RBAC in Azure pretty much. So just because I've connected to my Intune tenant, I just can't do everything. It's always, in this scenario here, it's user-based. So any permission my user have, I can do from PowerShell. But if I don't have any permissions on my user, I can't do anything. So I'll always keep that in mind when you play around with this, that it is always permission-based. So if your user you log on to doesn't have permissions to do anything in Intune manually, you can't do it from PowerShell either. And from here, we can do get-intune device compliance policy that we looked at before. If I run this command here, I will get back all my compliance policies and the information that those policies entails. I can also do get Intune manage devices. This will retrieve all my devices in Intune. So in my test tenant, there's about 20 devices or something like that. But here again, I get information about my devices. So here we have a Android device. The OS version is Android 8. I can see the owner type. I can see the device name, the user ID. And all of this information here again is data from Graph, just presented in another way. So instead of seeing it from the Intune portal, you would see the same information here if you went in and clicked on a device and you can see device information. I'm retrieving all the data that's stored in Graph just through PowerShell instead. I also shortly want to mention paging. Paging is important when you're working in large environments because when you do a web request through a Graph API, there is a limit on 1,000 objects. So let's say I run get Intune manage devices and I have 10,000 objects or 10,000 machines. I will only, if I don't take paging in consideration, I will only get back data from 1,000 objects. So that means that I'm still missing 9,000 objects. So if I want to put this in a variable, I will only get the top 1,000 objects, unless we actually pipe it to get msgraph all pages. So if I would do this, I will get all my 10,000 objects within my variable. If I remove this, I will only get 1,000. and that's just a hard limit. There's pretty decent documentation on it, but my observation is that there is a lot of people who doesn't know that there is an actual limit on 1,000 objects when you retrieve pages through Graph API. But here's a link to the documentation as well that you can look at if you want to. Before we continue on with some live demos here, I wanted to also mention the schema version and also the app ID. Because this can be important when you want to start doing stuff in production environments. So everything you do within the Intune portal, or the device management portal, as soon as you're in here, you're clicking around, you're doing your stuff, you're always talking to the beta version of the schema. So sometimes if you run Graph API and the Intune PowerShell SDK, and you don't change the schema to beta, you can run into some error messages and some issues. So it's a good idea to always do update MS Graph environment to change it to beta. And with the app ID, this is pointing to a Azure app. And I will talk a little bit more about that later on. But let's continue. So we already done a sync to a device through the portal here. We went into the device and we clicked sync where there is. So we can sync from here. We've also done a sync from the Graph Explorer while coupling the request URL. And now we can also do a sync through the PowerShell SDK. And this was actually a thing that I had to use in a production environment because we had a customer reaching out to us about, they had a problem. They had a lot of iOS devices. I think they had like 2,000 or 3,000 different iOS devices. And there was something wrong with the Outlook profile or the email configuration. There was something wrong with it. And the only solution they found was that doing a sync to the device fixed the problem. So the customer had a dilemma. Either they could go into the device management portal from here. They could pretty much find all their iOS devices and go into one of them and click sync. But that's pretty annoying to do that on 3,000 devices. Microsoft pretty recently added the bulk device action, but for some reason, I don't think that the sync option is in here. No, it's not. So you cannot do a bulk action sync from the actual portal. But this is the beauty with the Intune PowerShell SDK. So from here, we can actually do this. So the way we would do it is we would like to connect to MS Graph, to the tenant we would like to work with, of course. We would like to get all the devices. So in this case, I'm just going to do my Windows devices. So what I'm doing here is just I'm getting get Intune managed device. I'm filtering on all my Windows devices, and I'm putting that into a variable. So if I do this, I have all my devices there. And then I can just do a for each loop and just send a Intune invoke Intune managed device sync device on all my objects within my group here, within my variable. So right now, I'm just sending a sync to devices that's in my variable here. So this is pretty neat when you want to do something on a large scale. And there is not a lot of PowerShell needed to do this. It's pretty simple when you use the SDK. So that was the Intune PowerShell SDK. I have a few more demos that we could go through as well. Because one thing I want to show you is one of the biggest pains that I've experienced is that since we are always working with Azure AD groups within the portal or within Intune, there is no easy way to actually go to a Azure AD group and see what's been applied to that group. You always have to go into maybe your policy or your application and see which group it's been assigned to. So, and I've seen this question come up a lot of times. So if I go into my Azure AD and I go into my Windows, to my group here, I can't from here see any things that is related to what's been assigned to Intune to my Azure AD group. So what I've done here is I have a PowerShell script that actually looks at a PowerShell group, an Azure AD group, and what it does is it just looks for any configuration from Intune. So right now I'm looking for device compliance, device configuration, PowerShell scripts, administrative templates, whatever it could be. So what I can do is if I run this script here, I won't go through it in detail. But what I'm essentially doing is I'm looking at an Azure AD group that's called All Windows. And then I'm running the PowerShell SDK, the Intune PowerShell SDK, and just list out, okay, on this group here, I found 3 apps. I had .NET, I have Microsoft Edge, and I have Office 365. I also have device compliance policies. I found 2. So these 2 device compliance policy has been applied to this Azure AD group. And this is also a way to just make administrating your daily administrative stuff easier. So that's why I love the PowerShell SDK, Intune PowerShell SDK, just to be able to do stuff like this that sometimes is hard to do within the actual portal itself. And I see I'm almost out of time here, but before we go, I just want to mention that there is some useful links that we can take a look at. So remember, the PowerShell Intune samples is not using the SDK. So this would be the more advanced stuff, I would say. If you're a beginner and you just want to get started, you can use the Intune PowerShell SDK. It's terrific. I love it. I can't work without it anymore. I need it in my life. And also, I have a lot of examples and demos on my blog. So you can go to timmyit.com. And from there, you can find a lot of posts I've done. I've covered how to do the sync device, how to get the application deployment for different stuff to Azure AD groups, and a bunch of other stuff as well. So with that, I'm actually gonna have a look at the chat. I haven't been able to look at the chat during my time here.
No, that was a question for if you could upload and configure applications as well with Intune, and I answered that yes, you can, of course.
Oh,
there are samples for it as well.
Yes, there is a lot of examples. There's a lot of people working with the SDK now and also Graph API to make stuff easier. I've seen a lot of great stuff, both on Facebook and Reddit and all kinds of different communities online.
Any more questions?
Yes.
Just praise for your great session.
Yeah. There's so much stuff to talk about, really, but I think it was good. 45 minutes.
Yeah, I watched it, was it a couple of weeks ago? And that's why I asked you to do it here again, because I thought it was really useful. So thank you very much for that. I will stop the recording.
Thank you.
And then